Silas Crowder didn't even look at her when he said it. He just laughed, loud enough for the whole auction yard to hear, and pointed at the 37 starving goats penned in the far corner like something the valley had already decided to throw away. $2, Eliza Marlowe said quietly. Crowder turned around then, really looked at her worn dress, her round face flushed from the summer heat, her strong hands gripping the auction ticket like it meant something. Then he laughed harder. "Somebody get this woman's husband," he called out. "Tell him his wife just bought 37 ways to go broke." The yard erupted, and Eliza stood there, ticket in hand, 37 dying goats at her back, with every single person in Redstone Hollow laughing at her future. If that had been you, standing in that yard with $2 left and a crowd of strangers deciding your worth, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something in you, something about people who refuse to quit, when the world told them they should, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me the name of your city or your country, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It costs nothing. It means everything. Now let's go back to Redstone Hollow. The morning of the auction, Eliza Marlowe counted their money 3 times. Not because she thought the number would change. She counted it because she needed her hands to be doing something while her mind worked through the problem, and her hands had always been better at staying calm than the rest of her. $31. $31 and a farm that hadn't turned a real profit in 2 growing seasons. 40 rocky acres in the high foothills west of the valley floor, land that their nearest neighbor, old Hector Prine, had once described, without any particular cruelty, as the kind of ground God put rocks in so he wouldn't have to think of a better use for it. She folded the bills back into the tin and pushed it under the floorboard in the bedroom. Caleb was already outside. She could hear him moving around the barn, the slow, shuffling kind of movement that meant he was thinking again, which meant he was going to bring up the cow again, which meant they were going to have the same argument they'd been having for 3 weeks. She pulled on her boots and went out to meet it. "Morning," he said without turning around. "Morning." He was leaning on the fence post looking down toward the bottomland, where you could just make out the green edge of Crowder's pasture, fat and lush and well-watered from the creek that everyone on the flat ground got a share of, and everyone up in the hills did not. "Auctions today," Caleb said. "I know. There's going to be some good dairy stock." Eliza looked at the side of his face. "He wasn't a bad man, Caleb Marlowe. I was 29 years old and already carried himself like a man who'd been disappointed so many times. He'd started building the disappointment in early, before anything could go wrong, so at least the letdown would feel familiar." "Caleb," she said, "we need a cow, Eliza. We need $8 just to keep the well pump working. We need the north fence replaced before the rains come. We need milk," he said. "We need something this farm can actually produce. A good dairy cow gives us milk, gives us butter. A good dairy cow costs $20 minimum," she said. "That's not counting feed. That's not counting the fact that there is no bottomland grass on this property, and we both know it." He was quiet for a moment. "So we just don't try anything?" "I didn't say that." "Then what are you saying, Eliza?" She looked at the land, the hills behind the barn rising up rough and boulder-strewn, covered in the kind of scrubby vegetation that cattle turned their noses up at. Thistles, wild mustard, brush so woody it could break a scythe blade. Useless. Everyone said so. Even she had thought so, coming on 2 years ago. "I'm saying we go to the auction," she said, "and we keep our eyes open." Caleb didn't look convinced, but he got the wagon. What? The Redstone Hollow livestock auction happened every 3rd Saturday of the month in a wide dirt yard behind the feed merchant's warehouse on the main road. By the time the Marlowes arrived, the place was already crowded. Ranchers in good boots, merchants and their wives in clean clothes, farmhands leaning against fence rails, chewing tobacco, and commenting on every animal that came through the gate with the particular confidence of men who knew more than they did. Eliza climbed down from the wagon and felt, as she always did in town, the slight shift in the air around her. The flicker of eyes moving toward her and then away. She was used to it. Had been used to it since childhood, the way people looked at a big-bodied woman, a wide woman, a woman who didn't fit the shape they thought a woman ought to be. The look that was never quite rude enough to call out, but never quite not there either. She kept her chin level and walked. Caleb stayed close. Whatever his faults, He had never once, in 3 years of marriage, joined in with the people who looked at his wife that way. She gave him credit for it. The cattle were going through first, long-horned range stock and a few draft animals, and the prices were reasonable enough to make even the buyers look slightly pained. Crowder was near the front, as always. Silas Crowder was not a tall man, but he had the kind of physical presence that came from 20 years of getting exactly what he wanted, and it made him seem taller than he was. He had a cattle operation of maybe 300 head, property running along the Prime Valley bottomland, and a habit of speaking to people with less than he had, as if their poverty were a personal failing he was trying to be charitable about. He glanced at Eliza when she walked past. He glanced and then looked away, like she was a fence post. Like she was part of the scenery. She filed it away and kept walking. She was working her way along the holding pens at the back of the yard when she found them. 37 goats. They were in the last pen, crammed together in the heat, ribs showing through their rough coats, eyes dull and sunken in the way that animals got when they'd been underfed so long they'd stopped expecting things to be otherwise. 3 of them were lying down. One had a badly infected hoof the auctioneer's man had wrapped in dirty cloth and clearly forgotten about. The tag on the pen said, "Mixed breed lot, no reserve, minimum bid $1." Eliza stood at the fence for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, her mother's mother, a Wisconsin woman named Hilda Brower, who had kept a small goat dairy on 20 acres of rough farmland outside a town so small it didn't have a bank. Eliza had spent 2 summers there as a girl, 7 and 8 years old, following her grandmother through the morning milking, watching her work the cheese press with her big weathered hands, learning the patience it took to do something carefully and repeatedly until the result was something worth having. She hadn't thought about that in years. Not really. She looked at the goats. She looked at the hills she'd ridden through on her way into town. The high country above the Marlowe farm, scrubby and rock-studded and full of exactly the kind of tough, deep-rooted plants that no cattle rancher in the valley would waste a second thought on. Something moved in her chest. Not certainty, not quite, but something adjacent to it. "What are you looking at?" Caleb had found her. "Goats," she said. He looked at the pen. He took in the condition of the animals. She watched his face cycle through a few different expressions before settling on something careful and worried. "Eliza. They're sick because they've been penned too long without proper forage," she said. "Look at how they're standing. They're not diseased. They're just... Eliza, we came here to look at dairy cattle. And the dairy cattle cost $20 each, and we have $31 total. So we go home," he said. "We save up. We come back. There's a drought coming, Caleb. You know it same as I do. By the time we've saved enough for a decent dairy cow, the bottomland grass is going to be burning up, and good cattle prices are going to go through the roof because every rancher in the valley is going to be offloading stock they can't feed." He rubbed the back of his neck. "And 37 goats is a better plan." "They'll eat what we have," she said. "They'll eat everything up on those hills that nothing else will touch." "And then what? We become goat people?" "Eliza, nobody in this valley—" "My grandmother made cheese," Eliza said. "Hard cheese. The kind that keeps for months. The kind that doesn't need ice or a cold cellar in midsummer." Caleb looked at her. Then he looked at the goats. Then he looked at her again with the expression of a man trying to find the reasonable objection to an argument he already partly suspected was right. That was the moment Silas Crowder walked by. He wasn't walking to her. He was walking past, on his way to examine a draft horse on the other side of the yard. But he slowed when he saw what they were looking at, and then he stopped, and then that familiar expression spread across his face, the one that was too controlled to be called a sneer but was in every functional sense exactly that. "You two thinking about the goat lot?" he said. "Just looking," Caleb said. Crowder made a sound in his throat. "Save your dollar," he said. "Half those animals won't survive the month. The other half aren't worth the feed it'd take to keep them." He looked at Eliza then, and there was something in his eyes that she recognized from other men, other times. That measuring look that went from her face to her body, to her worn dress, and came back with a verdict it had reached before it started. "Tell you what, Mrs. Marlowe, you buy those goats, and I'll buy them back from you in 60 days for exactly what you paid." He smiled. "Call it a lesson in livestock." He walked away. The men standing nearby laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Caleb said quietly, "Eliza, go get us a number," she said. What? An auction number. Go get it. He stared at her for 3 full seconds. Then he went. The bidding on the goat lot lasted approximately 45 seconds. Nobody else bid. Eliza raised her number and said, $2, and the auctioneer looked around the yard like he was waiting for someone to rescue the situation, and when nobody did, he brought the hammer down and the whole thing was over. $2 for 37 goats. The laughter that rolled through the yard wasn't loud. It was the worst kind, low and warm, the kind shared between people who consider themselves reasonable, who would never say anything cruel directly to a woman's face, but who also felt that reality had just delivered a natural and somewhat amusing verdict. She heard Crowder's voice from somewhere behind her. Somebody find her husband. Tell him his wife just bought 37 ways to go broke. She heard the laughter follow it. She stood at the pen fence with her auction receipt in her hand, and she felt the heat of it. Not on her face, because she had trained her face for years not to show certain things, but somewhere lower, somewhere in her chest and her stomach. A hot and particular kind of anger that she had learned, also over years, to convert into something useful. Caleb appeared at her shoulder. His face was the color of a man who wanted the ground to offer him an alternative to the present moment. We need to borrow a larger wagon, she said. Eliza, the Hendersons have one. They're here somewhere. Go find them and ask nicely. She turned and looked at the goats. The one with the infected hoof was still lying down. And find out if there's a farrier on the grounds today. A farrier. That hoof needs cleaning. We're not hauling a goat 40 minutes in a wagon with an infection getting worse. Caleb stood there for another moment. You're really doing this, he said. It wasn't a question anymore. I'm already doing it, she said. Go find the Hendersons. What? She had asked Caleb for one thing on the ride home, while the goats shifted and complained in the borrowed wagon behind them, and the late afternoon heat pressed down on the road like a flat iron. Give me 1 summer, she said. That's all I'm asking for. 1 summer to see if this works. After that, if I'm wrong, we do it your way. He didn't look at her for a long moment. What's my way? He said. I don't know yet, she said, but you'll think of something and I'll listen to it. 1 summer, Caleb. The wagon creaked. A goat somewhere behind them let out a long, wavering bleat that sounded almost like a complaint about the terms. 1 summer, he said finally. She nodded. She looked ahead at the road, at the hills rising up beyond their farm boundary, at the scrubby and rock-filled and supposedly worthless land she'd been trying to figure out for 2 years. And she thought about her grandmother's hands on the cheese press, the particular smell of a dairy in summer, the way hard cheese looked when you cut into it after months of aging, pale and firm, nothing like the soft, wet things that spoiled in 3 days. She wasn't sure it would work. That was the part she didn't say out loud. She wasn't sure. She wasn't some woman in a story who had seen the future clearly and moved through it without doubt. She was a 24-year-old woman with 37 sick goats in a borrowed wagon and $29 left to her name, because she'd asked Caleb to tip the Henderson boy $1 for the wagon loan, and a husband who was trying to believe in her and not quite all the way there yet. She wasn't sure, but she had looked at those hills every single day for 2 years, and something had been nagging at her, something she hadn't had language for, until she stood at that pen fence and looked at those goats, and the thing had finally clicked into place like a key in a lock. Other people looked at the rocky high ground and saw waste. Eliza looked at it and saw a pasture that nobody else was using, that nobody else even wanted. She looked down at her hands on the wagon reins, wide hands, strong hands, her grandmother's hands, her mother had always said, and never quite meant it as a compliment. She tightened her grip. 37 goats, $2, 1 summer. Whatever happened next was already in motion. The first morning after the auction, Eliza was up before the sky turned gray. Not because she'd slept well. She hadn't. She'd lain in bed listening to Caleb's breathing even out beside her and stared at the ceiling and run the numbers over and over in her head the way you do when the numbers aren't good enough, and you keep hoping they'll change if you look at them from a different angle. They didn't change. $29, 37 goats, 40 rocky acres, and a summer that was already threatening to be the hottest one in a decade. Those were the facts, and the facts didn't care how long she stared at them. She got up, pulled her boots on in the dark, and went out to check on the animals. They'd put the goats in the old hay barn for the night, the one with the broken east wall they'd been meaning to repair since last March, and hadn't gotten around to because there was always something more urgent demanding the same money. The goats were awake already, most of them on their feet, pressing against the fence boards with a kind of low, anxious energy that told her they were hungry but not yet hopeless. That was something. Animals that had given up didn't move like that. She stood at the barn door and counted them in the dim light. 37. All present. The one with the infected hoof. She'd started thinking of him as stubborn, because he'd fought the farrier at the auction grounds with everything his skinny body had, was lying in the corner, but his eyes tracked her when she walked in, which was better than the flat, uninterested stare of an animal slipping away. She crouched down next to him and unwrapped the fresh cloth she'd put on the night before. The infection was bad, worse than she'd let on to Caleb, because Caleb already had enough things to worry about, and one sick goat in a herd of 37 was not the conversation she needed to be having on night one of her one summer. She cleaned it as carefully as she could, repacked it with the poultice her grandmother had taught her for exactly this kind of wound, bread mold and pine pitch, and a particular clay from the creek bank that her grandmother had called by a German name Eliza couldn't pronounce but had never forgotten the look of. It probably wouldn't work. She did it anyway. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the rest of them. At the jutting ribs and the dull coats and the hollow-cheeked faces of animals that had been surviving on not enough for too long. "All right," she said quietly. "Not to anyone, just to the barn. Let's see what we've got to work with." She let them out at first light. She'd expected them to scatter maybe, or mill around uncertainly the way animals did when they'd been confined so long they'd forgotten what open ground felt like. Instead, they moved. All of them, within about 3 minutes of the barn door opening, heading uphill with a kind of focused, purposeful energy that surprised her, like they already knew, like they could smell what was up there. She followed them. It took her the better part of the morning to get a sense of what they were doing. They weren't grazing the way cattle grazed, moving slowly across a field and pulling up grass in long sweeps. They picked. They nosed through the brush, pulling this plant and rejecting that one, stripping leaves from the woody stems of the wild mustard with a neat, practiced efficiency. They ate thistles, the whole plant, spine and all, with what she could only describe as satisfaction. They worked the hillside the way experienced hands worked a difficult piece of land, knowing where the good stuff was and going directly to it. By mid-morning, she was watching a heavy-set doe work her way through a dense stand of the woody clover that grew along the north-facing slope, the kind of plant that came back every year, no matter how dry the summer got, because its roots went down farther than anything had a right to. Eliza stood there in the heat and thought, deep roots. The forage up here wasn't lush, it wasn't easy, but it wasn't going anywhere either, not in a drought, not in summer heat, because these plants had survived on this hillside for decades, by going deeper than anything else was willing to go. She started taking notes that evening. She didn't have a proper ledger, they couldn't afford one, so she used the blank back pages of an old seed catalog, writing in the small tight script she'd developed as a girl when paper was something you didn't waste. What the goats ate, how much, which slopes they preferred, which plants they returned to and which ones they sampled once and left alone. Caleb found her at the kitchen table after supper, surrounded by the catalog pages, a stub of pencil in her hand. "What is all that?" he said. "Records," she said. He sat down across from her and looked at the pages without touching them. "Records of what?" "What they're eating, where they're ranging, which animals are strongest." She turned a page toward him. "See this? The does are eating more of the wild mustard than the bucks. I don't know yet if that means anything, but I want to know if it keeps." He was quiet for a moment. Not the skeptical quiet from before, something slightly different, more like a man recalibrating. "How's the one with the bad hoof?" he said. "Still upright," she said. "That's all I'll say tonight." He nodded, got up, came around the table and kissed the top of her head, which was something he did when he didn't have words and knew it. Then he went to bed. She stayed up another hour with her seed catalog pages and her pencil stub, and the particular kind of focused worry that was, she had found, the closest thing to hope available to a person in her situation. The milk came in the third week, not all at once. The does came into production gradually, one and then two and then a small flood of them, as they put on weight from the hillside forage, and their bodies remembered what they were supposed to be doing. The milk was different from what Eliza expected. Richer, thicker. It had a smell to it, faintly herbal and wild, that she first thought might mean something was wrong and then realized was simply what happened when animals ate 100 different plants instead of one kind of grass. She tasted it standing at the barn in the early morning and stood there for a moment with the cup in her hand. Her grandmother's dairy had smelled like this. Not exactly. Nothing was exactly anything from 30 years ago, when you tried to reach back for it, but close enough that something in her chest moved in a way that had nothing to do with the business plan. She thought, this is what she was trying to remember. This is the thing she'd been reaching for without knowing it. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, especially not standing in a barn at 5 in the morning with the day's work ahead of her. But she held the cup for another moment, just one, and let herself be 24 years old and far from Wisconsin and uncertain about nearly everything, and then she drank the rest of the milk and went to get her cooking pot. The cheese problem was where things got hard in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. She knew the general shape of what her grandmother had done. She remembered the steps the way you remember something learned at 7, not as a precise procedure, but as a series of images and sensations. The smell of the warming milk, the way the curd looked when it was ready to be cut, the heft of the weights on the press. The emotional memory of the thing was intact. The technical memory was full of gaps. Her first attempt was a disaster. She overheated the milk, not by much, maybe 5 degrees, but enough. And the curd she got was grainy and mealy, and when she pressed it and let it set for a day, it had the texture and approximate flavor of damp chalk. She fed it to the goats. They ate it without complaint, which told her nothing about its quality since goats would eat nearly anything. She sat down at the kitchen table that evening and put her face in her hands. Not for long. She gave herself exactly as long as it took to feel the full weight of the failure. The wasted milk, the wasted firewood, the wasted morning. And then she lifted her head and picked up her seed catalog pages and started writing down everything she remembered about what had gone wrong. Caleb came in from the north fence repair and found her there. "How'd the cheese go?" he said, and something in his voice told her he'd already looked in the root cellar and seen the empty shelves. "It didn't," she said. He pulled out a chair and sat down. He didn't say anything immediately, which she appreciated. With another man, it might have been the silence of a person waiting to say, "I told you so." With Caleb, it was just the silence of a man who knew when his wife needed a minute. "It was the temperature," she said. "I got the milk too hot, and the protein broke down wrong. Grandmother had a system for it. She'd hold her hand over the pot. I remember her doing it, but I can't remember what she was feeling for." "How warm is too warm?" he said. "That's what I'm trying to work out. What if—" He stopped, started again. "What if you used your elbow, like for a baby's bathwater?" She looked at him. "Just cooler than uncomfortable," he said, a little defensively. "I don't know anything about cheese. That's just— I'm thinking out loud." She thought about it. "That might actually be close," she said slowly. "Grandmother always said the milk couldn't be angry. That was her word for it. She said angry milk makes bad cheese." They sat with that for a moment, two people trying to reconstruct a dead woman's knowledge from fragments and feelings. "Try again tomorrow?" he said. "Try again tomorrow," she said. The second attempt was better. Not good. She wouldn't have called it good, but recognizably in the direction of the thing she was aiming for. The curd formed correctly this time, silky and smooth, pulling cleanly away from the way she half remembered it should. She cut it carefully, the way she'd seen her grandmother's knife move through the vat, and then she did the thing she wasn't sure about. The second gentle heating, the slow stirring. And when she pressed it that evening and wrapped it in the boiled muslin she'd cut from an old flour sack, it felt right in a way the first attempt hadn't. She put it in the root cellar and tried not to think about it for 3 days. She failed at that. She thought about it constantly. But she didn't go down to look at it because her grandmother had always said that cheese needed to be left alone in the same way that some arguments needed to be slept on. Interference never helped anything along. On the 3rd day, she went down with a candle and a knife. The wheel was small, barely 2 pounds, and it had formed a thin rind on the outside that was just starting to go the faintest yellow-gold color. She pressed it gently with one finger. It resisted, then gave just slightly, the way a good firm thing gave when you pressed it. She cut into it. The inside was pale and close-grained, and it had the faint herbal smell of the hillside forage working its way through the fat of the milk. She cut a small piece and ate it standing there in the root cellar by candlelight. It was not perfect. It was too salty. She'd overestimated the salt. and the texture was slightly crumbly where it should have been firmer. But underneath those correctable mistakes, it had something. A flavor that was unusual and clean and interesting in the way that things from a specific place were interesting, like you could taste the land it had come from. She stood there in the root cellar for a long time. Then she went upstairs and told Caleb they needed to figure out a proper press. Martha Bell came into the picture the way most important things came into Eliza's life. Sideways, through a problem she hadn't been expecting. Martha lived a mile and a half east of the Marlowe farm on a 10-acre strip of river bottom land that her late husband had left her when he died of fever 2 winters ago. She had a 7-year-old son named Thomas, who had been sick most of his short life with the kind of persistent lung trouble that the valley doctor described as constitutional weakness. And that actually meant nobody knew what to do about it. She was 31 years old and looked 45. Not because she was a frail woman, but because she had been working herself to exhaustion for 2 straight years, trying to hold on to land that was barely enough to keep them eating. Eliza had known her by sight for a year. You knew most people in a settlement the size of Redstone Hollow by sight, whether you wanted to or not. But they hadn't spoken more than a handful of times. Martha was not an unfriendly woman. She was a busy one, which was a different thing entirely. What brought them together was a broken wheel. Martha's cartwheel shattered on the rocky stretch of road that ran along the base of the Marlowe property, and the impact threw 2 of her water buckets into the ditch and left her standing in the heat of a Tuesday afternoon with a useless cart, a long walk home, and a child beside her who was breathing with that shallow, careful quality that worried Eliza the moment she spotted them from the hillside where she'd been checking on the herd. She came down the slope with 2 of the water buckets she'd been using for the cheese work, and got there before Martha had finished calculating the exact dimensions of her situation. "I've got a wheel hub that might fit," Eliza said. "Caleb's been meaning to throw it out, but it might be worth trying." Martha looked at her. "That's Marlowe land," she said. Not accusingly, just placing herself in the geography. "It is," Eliza said. "I'm Eliza." "I know who you are," Martha said, and there was something in her voice that Eliza couldn't immediately read. Not unkind, but careful in the way a woman got careful when she'd been offered help that came attached to things she couldn't afford. "I'm not asking for anything," Eliza said. "It's just a wheel hub, and it's either going to fit or it isn't." It fit, barely, well enough to get Martha's cart moving again. Caleb came out and helped with the repair, and Thomas sat on the fence and watched the whole thing with the grave attentiveness of a child who spent a lot of time watching adults work and not much time playing. Eliza brought water out for all of them, and while they drank, she told Martha, mostly just to have something to say, about the cheese, about the second attempt, about the flavor she hadn't expected. Martha was quiet through most of it. Then she said, "I know how to press it." Eliza looked at her. "My mother kept dairy goats," Martha said, "back in Ohio. I know the pressing and the aging and the salting. I haven't done it in 15 years, but I remember it." A pause. "You're over-salting." "I know," Eliza said. "Salt draws moisture. Too much, and you get crumble instead of grain." "I know that now," Eliza said. "I didn't know it 3 days ago." They looked at each other. 2 women on a hot Tuesday afternoon, each calculating what the other one could offer and whether it was safe to want it. "I could come some mornings," Martha said carefully. "Thomas is manageable in the mornings. If it ever came to something, if the cheese ever came to something." She stopped. "Half," Eliza said. Martha blinked. "Half what?" "Half of whatever it earns. Your knowledge is worth as much as my goats. Maybe more right now." "That's too much," Martha said. "That's what it's worth," Eliza said. "I'll argue with you about it later if you want, but I'd rather you just said yes." Martha was quiet for a moment. She looked at Thomas on the fence, who was watching a goat on the hillside above with the focus of a child who had discovered something interesting and wasn't sure yet what to do about it. "Yes," she said. What followed was 6 weeks that Eliza would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the hardest and most clarifying period of her life. Not the most painful. She'd had worse years, years with illness and grief woven through them. But clarifying in the specific way that hard physical work with a clear goal was clarifying, when every day had a shape to it, and the shape made sense even when everything hurt. She was up before light, every morning, out to the barn, then up the hillside to check on the herd, then back down to begin the milk collection. Martha arrived by 7 most mornings, Thomas in tow, and together they worked through the milk, heating, culturing, cutting the curd, stirring, pressing. In the cramped kitchen and the lean-to beside the barn that Caleb had hastily enclosed with salvaged lumber to give them a space that was at least nominally separate from the living quarters. The equipment was an ongoing improvisation that bordered on comedy. Their cheese kettle was the largest cooking pot Eliza owned, a 30-quart cast iron thing that was meant for rendering lard and that she had to constantly monitor because it heated unevenly on one side. Their draining cloth was boiled muslin from flour sacks and old shirts, and they went through a staggering amount of it because it had to be rinsed and reboiled after every use, and sometimes it didn't dry in time, and they had to make decisions about how clean was clean enough. Their press, Caleb's contribution, built over 3 nights with scrap oak from the woodpile and iron rods salvaged from a broken plow, worked, mostly, if you didn't ask too much of it. There was a period of about 10 days, around the 4th week, when every single thing went wrong at once in a way that felt almost personal. The weather turned, not the drought, which was still building, but a false break. A week of cloudy, humid days that did terrible things to the aging cheeses in the root cellar. 3 wheels went wrong simultaneously, developing molds of the wrong color in the wrong places. Martha cut into one and sniffed it carefully and said it was a moisture problem, not contamination. And she was right, but it meant losing a week's production and spending 2 days improving the ventilation in the cellar with a system of small bored holes and a tin-roofed vent that Caleb built while muttering things under his breath that Eliza chose not to hear. Then one of the best does, a big gray-mottled animal Martha had named Josephine, without asking anyone's permission somewhere around week 2, developed what looked like mastitis. Eliza caught it early enough that the infection didn't spread, but it knocked the dough out of production for 9 days at a point when they could not afford to lose any milk. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Thomas got sick. Not gravely, not the way that sent cold fear through the room, but the persistent low fever that his lungs threw up whenever he was pushed too hard or the temperature swung too dramatically, and Martha spent 2 nights sitting up with him instead of sleeping, and came to the farm on the 3rd morning with the hollowed-out look of someone running on less than they needed. Eliza looked at her standing in the kitchen doorway and said, "Go home." "I'm fine," Martha said. "You look terrible and Thomas needs you rested. Go home. Come back in 2 days." "The pressing schedule." "I know the pressing schedule," Eliza said. "I watched you do it every morning for 5 weeks. Go home, Martha." There was a moment where Martha seemed to be calculating whether she could argue about this, whether she had the energy for it, whether Eliza's offer was the kind that came with strings she couldn't see. Then she went home. Eliza managed the 2 days alone, badly, making 2 mistakes she wouldn't have made if she'd had Martha beside her, but managing. When Martha came back on the 3rd day, she didn't say anything about the mistakes, just assessed the state of things, adjusted where adjustment was needed, and moved forward. That was the thing about Martha Bell that Eliza came to understand over those weeks. She was not a person who wasted time backward-looking when there was forward work to be done. Thomas, for his part, recovered and came back with her, and resumed his post sitting on the fence watching the goats. He had developed a specific fascination with a small black and white buck they'd started calling Blackjack, who was not their best animal in any measurable way, but who had a personality of outrageous self-confidence that made him endlessly watchable. "He thinks he's the biggest one," Thomas told Eliza one afternoon, with the gravity of a 7-year-old reporting an important fact. "He does," Eliza agreed. "Is he wrong?" "Completely," Eliza said. "But he doesn't know it, so it works out the same." Thomas thought about this for a moment. "That's like some people," he said. Eliza glanced at him. He was watching Blackjack. She had a feeling he was thinking about specific people. Maybe people who had said specific things to him, the way children absorbed the social atmosphere around them even when adults believed they were shielding them from it. "That's exactly like some people," she said. The drought arrived properly in the 7th week. It didn't announce itself. Droughts never did. It was just that the rain that should have come didn't come, and then the rain after that didn't come either. And somewhere around the middle of August, the bottomland grass started going. The pale wrong color, and the creek that fed the valley floor dropped to a trickle, and the temperature climbed past 90 and then past 100 and settled there like it intended to stay. Eliza watched from the hillside as the bottomland dried out. She watched Crowder's cattle standing in the shrunken creek bed. She watched the condition of those animals, the big registered stock Crowder was so proud of, begin to slide as the pasture they depended on turned brittle and thin. She watched freight wagons come through town moving slower than usual, drivers pushing their animals hard in the heat because perishable goods had a narrower window when the temperature climbed like this and spoiled food meant a lost profit. She thought about the butter she'd seen at the general store last month, already going rancid at the edges of the crock. She thought about the fresh milk they'd been selling at the mercantile that now spoiled in 24 hours instead of 3 days. She thought about the meat in the butcher's cold room that the butcher was cutting and selling faster than usual, trying to move it before the heat took it. Then she went down to the root cellar and looked at the cheese. 14 wheels. Some of them had been aging for 3 weeks, some for 5. The oldest ones, the first successful batch, Martha's influence evident in their firmer texture and better grain, had formed hard, dry rinds and smelled like nothing that was going to spoil anytime soon. She cut a small piece from the oldest wheel and tasted it. The flavor had changed, deepened. The saltiness that had been too sharp in the early weeks had rounded out and become part of something more complex, and the herbal quality of the hillside forage, the wild mustard and the woody clover and the deep-rooted things, had concentrated into a flavor that was, she thought, genuinely interesting. Not just edible, not just acceptable. Interesting, in the way that things were interesting when they were specific to a place and a method and a particular set of hands. She took a piece upstairs and handed it to Caleb without saying anything. He tasted it. He stood there for a moment. He tasted it again. "That's different from the last one you had me try," he said. "About 3 weeks of aging," she said. "It's actually—" He paused, the way Caleb always paused before he said something he wasn't sure was allowed to be simple. "It's actually good." "I know," she said. "Like genuinely good. Not good for something we made in a cooking pot good. Just good." "I know," she said again, and she was smiling now, the specific smile of a person who has been right about something hard and is only just allowing themselves to feel it. He cut another piece and ate it. Then he leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at her. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, you were right about the goats." He said it the way Caleb said things he'd decided to say before he could think better of it, straight and without elaboration. "I should have trusted you faster. I knew that kind of, but I didn't say it." "You let me try," she said. "That was enough." "It wasn't, quite," he said, "but I'm saying it now." She let that sit. Outside, the heat pressed down on everything, and somewhere up on the hillside, 37 goats. No, 36. Stubborn had not made it. She'd found him one morning in the second week, and that had been a hard morning. Were moving through brush that no drought could kill, eating deep-rooted plants that had no intention of dying just because the summer got difficult. The freight hauler's name was Rufus Kane, and he came through Redstone Hollow once a week on his way to the mining settlements in the high country. And he had the look of a man who had spent so many years on the road that comfort had become a theoretical concept he no longer personally required. He stopped at the Marlowe farm, not because he knew anything about what they were doing there, but because his lead mule had thrown a shoe on the rocky stretch of road above the property, and Caleb was the closest person with a hammer and the right nails. Eliza brought water out while Caleb worked, and on an impulse she brought a small wedge of cheese on a piece of clean cloth. Not for any calculated business reason, or not only for that, just because it was what she had, and offering something to someone working in the heat in the middle of your property seemed like basic decency. Rufus Kane took the cheese with the absent politeness of a man accepting something to be polite and bit into it without particular expectation. He stopped chewing. He looked at the piece in his hand. He chewed the rest of it slowly, with the focused attention of a man recalibrating. "Where'd you get this?" he said. "I made it," Eliza said. He looked at her, then he looked at the hills above the farm. Then he looked at the cheese again. "How much of this do you have?" he said. 14 wheels right now. Each one runs about 3 to 4 pounds. Can you make more?" "We're making more every week," she said. "Why?" He put down the water cup and looked at her with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he already knew the answer to. "I run supplies to 4 mining camps between here and the Sutter Pass," he said. "Every week. In this heat, I lose maybe a quarter of my perishables before I reach the second camp. Bread molds. Butter spoils. Meat goes if I hit a slow stretch. He nodded at the remaining piece of cheese on the cloth. That right there keeps. How long does it keep? Months, Eliza said. The older the wheel, the longer. Miners pay premium for food that doesn't go bad on them, he said. They've been eating hardtack and dried beans most of the summer because that's what survives the trip. He picked up the last piece and ate it. I'll buy everything you've got right now, and I'll be back next week for more. What are you asking? Eliza had not prepared for this conversation. She had thought about it in abstract, had known that if the cheese was good enough, there would eventually be a market for it. But the eventually had felt safely distant, something to plan for after they'd solved 6 or 7 other problems first. She looked at Rufus Kane and thought fast. What are you paying for butter? She said. 25 cents a pound when I can get it. 60 cents a wheel, she said. 3 to 4 pounds, keeps for months in your wagon, no spoilage. He thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Done, he said. Caleb looked up from the mule's hoof. Eliza kept her face composed, which was the hardest thing she'd done all summer. I'll have everything ready when you come back through Friday, she said. Rufus nodded, resettled his hat, and went back to watching Caleb work on the shoe. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook and a pencil stub and wrote something in it. And Eliza understood that she had just become a line item in a freight hauler's supply schedule, which was perhaps the best news she had received in 2 years. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with her hands flat on the wood and her eyes closed. Then she went down to the root cellar and started counting what they had, and calculating what they could produce, and working out, for the first time with real numbers attached to it, what this summer was actually going to mean. Outside, the heat was still brutal. The bottomland was still drying up. The drought was nowhere near done with Redstone Hollow. But 14 wheels of pale hard cheese sat in the cellar below her feet, not spoiling, not sweating, not diminishing in any way that mattered, just aging slowly into something better than they'd been, the same way that certain kinds of difficult things did, given enough time and the right conditions and someone patient enough to wait. Eliza opened her eyes and picked up her pencil. There was a lot left to figure out, more than she'd worked through yet. But for the first time since the auction, since the laughter in the yard, since Silas Crowder's voice calling across the crowd for someone to find her husband, the numbers in her head were pointing in a direction she could live with. She bent over the seed catalog pages and started writing. Rufus came back on Friday, as promised, with an empty wagon bed and a list. He didn't make small talk. That was one of the things Eliza appreciated about Rufus Kane. He was a man who understood that other people's time had value, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. He pulled up, climbed down, handed her a folded piece of paper and said, "That's what the camps are asking for next week if you've got it." She unfolded it, read it, looked up. "That's 20 wheels," she said. "I know what it is," he said. "We have 14. Then I'll take 14. He pulled out his wallet. "And I'll be back in 10 days instead of 7. That give you enough time to make up the difference?" She did the math in her head, the way she'd been doing it for weeks now, automatically, in the back of her mind while she was doing other things. The does were producing well. Martha had worked out the timing so they could press 3 wheels every 2 days without compromising quality. With all of them working full days. "Maybe 17, she said. "Possibly 18. "I'll take everything you've got," he said. "And Eliza." He paused, which was unusual for him. The men at the second camp, the foreman there, fellow named Decker, he's been asking who makes it. Wants to know if there's a label or a mark. Something to tell it apart from other suppliers, if other suppliers start showing up. She hadn't thought about that. She stood there for a second with the folded paper in her hand. "I'll work something out," she said. He nodded, loaded the 14 wheels into his wagon with the methodical care of a man who understood that the thing he was transporting was worth more than most things he transported, and left. Eliza stood in the yard watching the wagon move down the road and thought about a label, about a name on a wheel of cheese, about what it meant that someone in a mining camp 40 miles away was asking who made it. Something had shifted. She could feel it the way you felt weather changing before any visible sign appeared. A pressure difference, a different quality to the air. She went inside and told Caleb they needed to build 2 more presses. The laughter in town had stopped. It didn't stop dramatically. There was no moment where someone stood up and publicly reversed their opinion. It just went quiet the way that certain kinds of mockery went quiet when the thing being mocked started working, gradually, in the way that water found the low places, And the people who had been laughing found other things to talk about and stopped mentioning the Marlowe goats. Eliza noticed it at the general store first. She went in for salt and muslin. They were going through a remarkable amount of both. And the woman behind the counter, a narrow-faced woman named Agnes Pratt, who had been reliably unpleasant to Eliza for 2 years, was not exactly warm, but she was different. She made eye contact. She weighed the salt without any of the pointed sign that had characterized their previous interactions. Small things, the kind that only meant something if you'd been tracking their absence. Caleb noticed it at the feed merchant when a man who had been among the laughers at the auction asked him, without quite meeting his eyes, whether the goats were working out. "They are," Caleb said, and offered nothing else, which Eliza thought showed considerable growth on his part. The money was real now. Not spectacular, they weren't wealthy, they weren't anywhere close to comfortable, but it was consistent and it was growing week over week in a way that nothing on the Marlowe farm had ever grown before. Rufus paid on delivery, always in coin, which Eliza kept in the tin under the floorboard and counted every Sunday evening the way her mother had counted her household money, the same serious attention to a ritual that represented safety. They paid off the pump repair. They bought proper aging boards for the root cellar, the cedar kind that breathed correctly. They bought 2 does from a farmer 40 miles north who had better bloodlines than their current herd, folding them in carefully so the existing animals weren't disrupted. They bought Martha a proper kitchen scale, which had the practical effect of making their salting far more consistent, and the measurable effect of making Martha look at it for a long moment before she said, "You didn't have to do this," in a tone that suggested she was aware it was exactly what Eliza had to do. Caleb built the 2 new presses. He built them better than the first one. The first one had been emergency carpentry, built fast under pressure. These were deliberate, with properly fitted joints and a more reliable pressure mechanism that Martha designed and Caleb executed, the 2 of them standing over the sketch on the kitchen table, arguing about tolerances in a way that was, Eliza observed, remarkably productive for 2 people who had never previously agreed on anything. Thomas got better in the way that Thomas sometimes got better. Not cured, not transformed, but stabilized, his lungs deciding to cooperate for the time being. He spent his days on the farm now most of the time while Martha worked, and he had appointed himself unofficial keeper of the herd's records, a job nobody had asked him to do, but that he performed with complete seriousness, producing a daily count in the small notebook Eliza had given him, and reporting any anomalies in the goat's behavior with the precision of a small scientist. "Josephine didn't go up the north slope this morning," he told Eliza one afternoon in early September. "Which way did she go?" "East side, the brushy part above the old fence line." Eliza noted it. Later that week she found what Josephine had found. A stand of a particular plant she didn't have a name for, something with small silver leaves and deep purple flowers that the doe had apparently decided was worth walking an extra quarter-mile to reach. She picked a handful, steeped it, tasted the tea it made, and spent the rest of the afternoon trying to identify it from the agricultural extension pamphlet she'd been borrowing from the library wagon. She never did identify it exactly, but she noted it in her seed catalog pages, and she noted when the milk from Josephine and the 3 other does who started visiting the same stand tasted different, cleaner, with a slightly brighter edge. And she set those does' milk aside and made a separate small batch from it. That batch aged for 5 weeks before she cut into it. When she did, she stood in the root cellar and cut a piece and had the unfamiliar experience of tasting something she'd made that she was fairly certain she'd never tasted anything quite like before. Not better than the regular wheels exactly. Different. Specifically, distinctively different, in a way that felt important though she didn't yet know why. She brought a piece up and put it in front of Martha without saying anything. Martha tasted it, looked up. "That's not the same," she said. "No." "What did you do different?" "Nothing," Eliza said. "It's the does that are ranging on the east slope, the ones that found that silver leaf plant." Martha ate another small piece and was quiet for a moment. "This is worth more," she said finally. "I think so too." "Rufus's miners aren't the right market for this one." Eliza nodded. She'd been thinking the same thing. Miners wanted food that kept and filled them up. This wheel was something else, something you ate slowly and thought about, something that belonged in a different kind of conversation. She didn't know yet where that conversation was happening or how to find it, but she wrote everything down. It was a Thursday when Silas Crowder rode up to the Marlowe property for the first time. Not to the house. He stopped at the fence line at the top of the road, where the Marlowe acreage began its uphill climb, and he sat on his horse and looked at things for a while. Eliza saw him from the hillside where she was checking on the afternoon graze. She watched him watch the herd. She watched him look at the goats moving through the brush with their particular efficient purposefulness. 36 healthy animals. 35 now with the new doe added to the count in her head, working the hillside that he'd written off as worthless. He didn't stay long. He turned his horse and rode back down the road without looking up at the hillside. Eliza watched him go and felt a cold thing move through her chest that was not quite fear and not quite premonition, but was adjacent to both. She'd made a mistake, she realized, not in the business. The business was right. But she'd been so focused on the work, on making the cheese and expanding the herd and managing the pressing schedule and dealing with the 1,000 daily details of building something out of almost nothing, that she'd stopped paying close enough attention to the social terrain around her. She'd let herself believe, in the specific way that people who were winning a small battle believed, that the war had changed shape. It hadn't. It had just been quiet. She came down from the hillside and found Martha in the lean-to washing muslin and said, "Crowder was on the fence line this afternoon." Martha's hands didn't stop moving. "Just looking?" "Just looking." "Crowder doesn't just look," Martha said. "I know." They looked at each other over the wet muslin and the bucket of soapy water, and neither of them said the thing they were both thinking, which was that everything they'd built over this summer was exactly the kind of thing that attracted the attention of men like Silas Crowder. That evening, Eliza didn't sleep well again, but for different reasons than before. The first sign came 2 weeks later, wrapped in the language of legality, which was how such things always came. A man Eliza didn't recognize rode up on a Tuesday morning with a document in a leather portfolio and introduced himself as a surveyor's assistant from the county seat. He was polite. He was professionally neutral in the way of men who delivered unpleasant information for a living and had learned to remove their own feelings from the transaction. He showed her a survey map, the shared water access line that ran along the eastern edge of the Marlowe property, a drainage channel that fed their well in the spring runoff and that they relied on in dry years to supplement the shallow well, was, according to the original land grant documentation, not as clear as previously understood. There was a question about the boundary, a question that would require a formal review. "A question raised by who?" Eliza said. The man was professionally neutral about that too. He said the matter was under county review, and she should feel free to consult with a legal representative. After he left, Eliza sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She didn't need anyone to tell her who had raised the question. The timing was not subtle, and Crowder was not a subtle man. He simply operated on the assumption that the people he dealt with were either too poor, too tired, or too poorly connected to fight back effectively, and he had been right often enough that he'd stopped worrying about it. Caleb came in from the barn and she told him. His face did several things in quick succession. "He can't just take the water access," he said. "He's not taking it," she said. "He's questioning it, which creates delay, which creates uncertainty, which costs us money if we have to hire legal counsel we don't have." "Then what do we do?" "We keep producing," she said. "We don't give him the satisfaction of slowing down." Caleb was quiet. She could see him working something out. "Eliza," he said, "there's something else. I didn't want to say it until I was sure." He sat down. "Henderson told me last week that the bank called in a note on the Garvey property. Old $30 note that everyone had forgotten about. Garvey's land went to auction 30 days later." She looked at him. "We have a note with the bank," she said. $30. "We took it out 2 springs ago for the well pump. Due date was extended informally by Director Hale when we couldn't pay on time. Extended informally." He said the last word again, with weight. "Which means it's not in writing anywhere." The cold thing in her chest from the day she'd seen Crowder at the fence line moved again, settling lower. "When's it due?" she said. "September 1st, Caleb said. "That's the original date. Hale extended it verbally, but if the bank decides to call it on the original date, how much do we have?" she said, though she knew. "After what we paid for the cedar boards and the new does," he said, $44. "That covers it," she said, with relief that lasted exactly 1 more second. "Except Rufus won't be back until September 3rd, Caleb said. "He owes us $18 from this last run." She did the math. $44 minus the 30 for the note left 14, which was not nothing, which was actually 2 months ago more money than they'd had at any point in recent memory. But $14 with a water dispute in progress and an expanding operation that required ongoing supply purchases was a very different number than it had been. Why would the bank call a note on the original date after an informal extension? She said, even though she already knew the answer. Caleb looked at her. Because somebody with influence suggested it might be in the bank's interest to do so, he said. She stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the hillside, at the goats moving through the late afternoon light, at the land everyone had written off. He's doing it right, she said. Not admiringly. Clinically. She was thinking out loud the way she worked through problems. He can't attack the product directly because the product is good and the market exists and he can't take that away. So he goes around. He attacks the foundation. Water rights. The banknote. He's not trying to beat us. He's trying to make us unstable enough to fall. So what do? Caleb said. We stop falling, she said. What Eliza did next she did without telling Caleb in advance, because she knew he would have argued about it, and the argument would have cost them time they didn't have. She went to see Director Hale at the Redstone Valley Bank. Hale was 60 years old with the look of a man who had spent 4 decades managing other people's money and had developed, as a result, the particular emotional temperature of someone who didn't get surprised easily. He received her in his office with the courteous wariness of a man who had learned that women who came to see him without their husbands generally had something specific in mind. She didn't waste time. She put her seed catalog pages on his desk, the records, the production logs, the delivery receipts from Rufus Kane, the pricing she'd established, the forward orders she'd received. Not everything was perfectly organized. These were working documents, not presentation materials, and they looked like what they were. The records of someone who had been too busy actually doing the work to have time to make the records pretty. She thought that was probably more persuasive than a neat ledger would have been. The note is $30, she said. I have it. I can pay it today if the bank requires the original date. I'm not here to dispute that. Hale looked at her across the desk. Then what are you here for, Mrs. Marlowe? To tell you what that $30 represents, she said, and what it could represent if the bank thinks about it differently. She laid out the numbers. The weekly production, the current price per wheel, the demand from the mining camps that was running ahead of their supply, the new doughs with better bloodlines, the aging stock in the cellar that increased in value the longer it sat, the territory, the word Rufus had used, that was currently theirs because nobody else in the valley was doing anything remotely like this. Hale looked at the pages. He picked up one of the delivery receipts and read it. Put it down. You're asking for an extension, he said. I'm asking for more than that, she said. He looked up. She held his gaze. This was the moment she'd been preparing for on the ride into town, the moment she'd been building toward since she'd stood at the fence at the auction with the receipt in her hand while men laughed around her. She had practiced what she was going to say, and now she found she didn't need the practiced version, which was a relief because the practiced version had sounded in her head like someone trying to sound confident, which was different from being it. I want a business loan, she said, $200, for equipment, additional animals, and a proper dairy structure. In exchange, the bank holds a note on the dairy operation and receives 10% of net receipts for 3 years. The silence in Hale's office had a quality she couldn't read. You've been operating for less than 1 summer, he said. I know. A $200 loan against an operation less than 6 months old, against an operation that has no spoilage losses, no drought vulnerability, growing demand, and a product that doesn't exist anywhere else in this valley, she said. The cattle operations you've been lending against for 20 years are losing animals to fever and drought right now. I've ridden past Crowder's South Pasture. He's lost at least 40 head this summer. How many notes does the bank hold against cattle operations that are currently underwater? She hadn't planned to say that. It came out with a directness that made her briefly wonder if she'd pushed too hard. Hale was quiet for a moment. The water access dispute, he said. I'm aware of it. I imagine you are, she said carefully. That creates uncertainty about the operation's long term. The goats don't use the water access, she said. They range on the high ground. The high ground plants have root systems that go 10 feet deep. My dairy operation doesn't depend on valley water. That's part of why it works. She paused. The water dispute is a dispute about a well I use for the house. It doesn't touch the dairy. Hale picked up another paper. Read it. She watched his face and tried to read it, and couldn't. "I'll need 3 days," he said. "The note date," she said. "The bank will hold the original note date in abeyance pending review," he said. "You have my word on that." She picked up her seed catalog pages and squared them against each other and stood up. "Thank you for your time, Director Hale." She walked out of the bank and across the street to where she'd tied her horse and stood there for a moment with her hand on the saddle and let herself feel, briefly and completely, how terrified she had been in that office. How much of what she'd projected as steadiness had been a performance of steadiness. How badly her hands had wanted to shake when she put the papers on his desk. Then she got on the horse and rode home to make cheese. Crowder moved faster than she'd expected. She'd thought she had days, maybe a week, before the water dispute escalated. She'd been wrong. 2 days after her meeting with Hale, she went to draw water from the drainage channel at the east fence line and found a new survey stake driven into the ground and a length of rope marking a claimed boundary that, if it held, would put the channel entirely on Crowder's side of the line. She looked at the stake. She looked at the rope. She pulled out her seed catalog pages and drew the line carefully, recording the stake's exact position and the date. Then she went home and told Caleb. He went out to look at it. When he came back, his jaw was set in the particular way it got when he was angry enough to be quiet about it. "He can't just plant a stake," Caleb said. "He just did," she said. "Whether it holds is a different question. We need a lawyer." "We need to not need a lawyer," she said. "Lawyers cost money and time, and Crowder knows that. Every legal process we get pulled into is one that costs us production and income he doesn't need us to have right now." She thought for a moment. What we need is for this to not matter. How does a water dispute not matter? "If the dairy doesn't need the water," she said, "the channel feeds our house well. If we find another source for house water and the dairy is on record as independent of the channel, then the dispute is about domestic access to a single well, not about our operation." "The old spring up near the North Boulder field," Caleb said slowly. "Prine used to use it before he deepened his own well." "How far is the pipe run?" 90 feet, maybe 100. "Can you do it?" He looked at her. "In a week, with help, maybe." "Ask Henderson if he'll work the pipe lane for trade credit," she said. "We'll give them cheese. You want to trade cheese for labor." "Cheese that keeps for months against labor we need now," she said. "Yes, that's exactly what I want to do." Caleb thought about this for a moment, in the way he thought about things that surprised him by being reasonable. "All right," he said. "I'll go see Henderson in the morning." She was already writing it down. 3 days after that came the news about Crowder's cattle. It came through Rufus Kane, who heard it at the feed merchant on his way through town and stopped at the Marlowe farm, not because he had a delivery, but because he thought Eliza ought to know. "Fever's hit Crowder's south herd," he said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. "Word is he's lost 60 head already. Some people are saying closer to 80. Eliza stood very still. "His north pasture's not affected yet," Rufus continued, "but the south pasture's on the bottomland, and the cattle have been concentrated around the creek because the grass is gone, and anything that bad gets concentrated gets—" He paused. "Well, you know how it spreads." She did know. "His cheese expansion," she said. "The stone dairy he was building." "Stopped," Rufus said. "They've pulled all the labor to deal with the sick animals. The cheesemakers he hired from Centerville have apparently gone home." He paused again. "I probably shouldn't feel satisfied about that. I know that's a lot of dead animals, and that's a bad thing. But I remember what he said to you at the auction, and I'm telling you what I'm telling you." "I don't wish the cattle dead," Eliza said. "The animals didn't do anything wrong." "No," Rufus said. "They didn't." They were quiet for a moment. "The mining camps are asking about larger orders," Rufus said, "for the fall season. The camps expand in fall when the weather cools and more men come through. I told them I'd ask." "How large?" she said. He told her. She stood there doing the math and feeling the vertigo of a number that was bigger than her current capacity by a factor that should have felt frightening, but instead felt like something else. Something she didn't have an easy word for. The specific feeling of a problem that was the good kind of problem, the kind that meant the thing you'd built was real enough to outgrow you. "I'll need until October to be confident I can meet those numbers," she said. "If the bank comes through with what I've asked for." Rufus looked at her. "The bank," he said. Not a question exactly. "I went to see Hale," she said. He was quiet. Then, He'd be a fool not to back you. He'd have been a fool to back me 3 months ago, she said. Now the math is different. He put his hat back on. I'll tell Decker to expect word by October, he said. And Eliza. He paused at the edge of the yard. Whatever Hale decides. The Marlowe name on a wheel means something to the men at those camps. That's real, and it's yours, and no banknote and no survey stake takes that away. He drove off. She stood in the yard for a long while after his wagon disappeared around the bend. The thing he'd said sat with her in a way she hadn't expected. The Marlowe name on a wheel. She had been thinking about the label since Rufus first mentioned Decker asking about it, turning it over in the back of her mind while she worked. She'd sketched 3 or 4 versions in the margins of her seed catalog pages. Nothing finished, nothing she was ready to commit to, just the shape of the idea. She went inside and found the sketch she'd made that felt closest to right. A small, simple mark, M for Marlowe, surrounded by the rough outline of a hillside, the kind a child might draw. Not beautiful, not refined, just honest, in the way that the cheese was honest, in the way that everything they'd done this summer had been honest, which was its chief quality and the hardest thing to copy. She set it on the table and went back to work. The cellar had 22 wheels aging now. The presses were running, the herd was healthy, Crowder's expansion had stopped, and his cattle were dying and his survey stake was in her fence line, and Hale hadn't given her an answer yet, and the water pipe wasn't laid, and 100 things were still uncertain and wrong and unresolved. And yet, she looked at the mark on the paper, at the rough hillside outline, at the M at its center. This wasn't the same farm she'd come home to after the auction. The land hadn't changed, the rocks were still rocks, the brushy hillside was still brushy. But something in the relationship between her and the land had shifted in a way that felt permanent, the way certain shifts felt when they were real ones rather than just temporary adjustments. She understood now what her grandmother had understood in Wisconsin, what the old woman had tried to pass on in the 2 summers Eliza had spent there as a girl, that a piece of land was not what it looked like. It was what you were willing to learn from it. It was what you were patient enough to find. She'd found it. She picked up the sketch and pinned it to the wall above the kitchen table where she could see it while she worked, and where Caleb could see it, and where Martha could see it, and where Thomas could look up at it from his notebook and ask what it was. It's a mark, she'd tell him. What kind of mark? The kind that means it came from here, she'd say. From this land, from these hills. He'd think about that with the grave attention he gave to everything. Then he'd write something in his notebook, because Thomas Bell wrote things down that he considered important. And she thought that was probably the best kind of person to have around when you were building something you wanted to last. Outside, September was starting to cool the edges of the days. The drought wasn't over, but the worst of the heat was breaking. On the hillside above the farm, 36 goats were moving through the brush in the long afternoon light, eating the things nobody else wanted, turning the supposedly worthless land into something that had started to matter. And in the root cellar below the house, 22 wheels of pale hard cheese were aging slowly, getting better in the dark and the quiet, the way things did when they'd been made right and given the time they needed. The Marlowe dairy was 3 months old, and Silas Crowder, for the first time in longer than anyone in Redstone Hollow could remember, was not entirely sure what to do next. Hale's answer came on a Wednesday morning, delivered not by a messenger but by the man himself, which told Eliza something before he'd said a word. Directors of small frontier banks did not ride out to farms to deliver bad news. They sent letters. They sent clerks. They kept themselves at a safe remove from the faces of people they were disappointing. The fact that Hale had come himself, had tied his horse at her fence post and walked up to her door in his good coat in the September morning heat, meant one of 2 things. Either what he had to say was complicated enough to require a face-to-face conversation, or it was good. She had learned in the last 3 months not to assume good. She opened the door before he could knock. He looked at her, looked past her into the kitchen, which smelled of warm milk and the particular sharp, clean smell of the muslin they boiled every morning, and where Martha was working at the back counter with the focused efficiency she brought to everything. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. "Director Hale," she said. "Come in." He sat at the kitchen table. She poured water. They were not in a position to waste coffee on uncertainty, and sat across from him and waited. He put a document on the table. She looked at it without picking it up. "The board reviewed your proposal," he said. "There was disagreement. He paused, in the way of a man who considered it important to be accurate. Significant disagreement. You're asking for a substantial loan against an operation that by any conventional standard is too young and too unconventional to merit it. I know what I'm asking for, she said. Let me finish, he said, not unkindly. The disagreement was not about your numbers. Your numbers are, frankly, better than most of what we review. The disagreement was about category. The board has never financed a goat dairy. Several members felt that the absence of precedent was itself a form of risk. He paused again. I overruled them. Martha's hand stilled at the counter behind her. Eliza picked up the document. $150. Not the $200 she'd asked for, but $150, at terms that were fair. Genuinely fair. Not the kind of fair that revealed itself to be something else on the third page. A 3-year note with the 10% revenue share she'd proposed. Payments beginning in January. She looked up. The water access dispute, she said, is not part of this agreement, Hale said. I want to be transparent with you about something, Mrs. Marlowe. Certain parties made representations to the bank about the wisdom of extending credit to your operation. I won't say who. I will say that the representations were made in a way that told me more about the person making them than about your operation. He straightened his coat. I've been banking in this valley for 22 years. I know the difference between a credit risk and a competitor trying to use my institution as a weapon. The room was very quiet. Thank you, Eliza said. Don't thank me, he said. Pay the note on time. He left. Martha waited until the sound of his horse had faded down the road, then said, without turning around, $150. Yes, Eliza said. What do we do first? Eliza sat at the table with the document in her hands and felt something she didn't entirely trust, something too close to relief, which had a way of making you careless. She set the feeling aside and picked up her pencil. Second press room, she said. Proper cedar boards throughout. 2 more does, good bloodlines. And I want a covered aging structure separate from the root cellar, something we can control the temperature in through the winter. Winter production, Martha said. You're planning year-round. If we can manage the forage through winter, the goats will range in winter, Martha said. They'll eat what's there. It won't be as rich, but it'll be consistent. She turned around and leaned against the counter and looked at Eliza with the particular expression she had when she was working through something she was fairly sure of but wanted to test. The silverleaf does. Their milk in winter might concentrate differently. Less variety in the forage means the flavor of what they are eating comes through stronger. Eliza thought about the wheel she'd cut 2 months ago in the root cellar. The one she'd known immediately was different. You think the winter milk from those does might be worth setting aside separately, Martha said, making a smaller batch, aging it longer. How much longer? 8 weeks minimum, maybe 12. That's a significant investment of time without knowing the result. Everything we've done has been a significant investment without knowing the result, Martha said, which was fair, and Eliza acknowledged it was fair with a nod and wrote it down. The water pipe from the North Spring was finished by the 2nd week of September. Henderson had done the work for a standing credit of 4 wheels of cheese per month, which was, Eliza suspected, a better deal for the Marlowes than the Hendersons fully understood, because Henderson's wife had developed a particular enthusiasm for the Marlowe cheese that was rapidly becoming the kind of enthusiasm that spread through a community whether or not anyone intended it to. The new pipe solved the practical problem. It solved the legal problem, too, in the way Eliza had intended. When the county surveyor came back to formally review the Eastern Channel boundary dispute, and he came, as these things always came, at the worst possible time, in the middle of a pressing day, Eliza was able to show him the new spring connection, the pipe manifold, the documentation she'd had Hale's clerk notarize, confirming that the dairy operation drew no water from the disputed channel. The surveyor made his notes. He looked at the stake Crowder had planted. He looked at Eliza's records. He looked at the fence line. He didn't rule that day. He said it would go to the county review board in October. But when he left with the expression of a man whose mourning had not produced the conclusion someone had been hoping for. Eliza watched him go and felt the tight thing in her chest ease slightly. Not gone, not resolved, but shifted enough to breathe against. She went back inside and kept pressing. The storm hit on the last Thursday of September, which was 2 days before the banknote's original due date and 3 days before Rufus Kane was scheduled to come through on his regular Friday run. She'd been watching the sky for 2 days. The valley had a particular way of building towards serious weather, a brass quality to the afternoon light, a stillness in the air that wasn't the peaceful kind of stillness, but the held breath kind. And she'd known something was coming. She'd moved the oldest and most valuable aging wheels from the outer shelves of the root cellar to the inner wall, had secured the goats in the barn an hour before the first roll of thunder reached them across the hills. What came was not just a storm. It was the kind of storm that a drought produced when it finally broke. 3 seasons of withheld water arriving in approximately 18 hours, with the focused intent of a thing that had been patient for a long time. The road down the valley became a river by midnight. The road up the high country behind the Marlowe farm, the rough track that wound through the boulder fields to the north, was impassable by morning for reasons that had nothing to do with water and everything to do with the mud that followed it. Rufus Kane could not get through. Eliza knew it before she walked to the fence line in the early morning to look down at the valley road. She could see from the hillside that the creek had jumped its banks across the bottomland, covering the road in 3 places she could count, and Rufus's route came directly through the worst of it. He would be stopped somewhere south of the crossing, waiting for the water to drop, which would take a minimum of 2 days and possibly 4. He owed her $18 from the last delivery. With his payment, she had enough to cover the note and the ongoing supply costs and keep a small working reserve. Without it, she had $26. The note was $30. She stood at the fence line in the wet, cold air of the morning after the storm and did the arithmetic, and then stood there a while longer, looking at the road that was not there anymore, and the sky that had delivered this particular problem with what felt like extraordinary poor timing. She went inside. Caleb was at the table. He'd been up most of the night checking on the goats and the barn roof and the aging structure they'd just finished, which had held, thank whatever forces governed the structural integrity of hastily built cedar outbuildings. He had the look of a man who had not slept and knew it. "Road's gone," she said. "I know," he said. "I went to look at first light. Rufus can't get through." "I know that too." She sat down across from him. They looked at each other across the table where she'd spent so many mornings planning and recording and calculating, the table that had the M sketch pinned above it and the seed catalog pages stacked to one side, and the faint ring stains from 100 cups of water and coffee. "We're $4 short," she said. "We could sell 3 or 4 goats," he said. He said it the way he said things he'd already decided were wrong but felt he had to say anyway, so the idea had been named and could be set aside. "Hector Prine was saying last week his wife wants a couple of milking animals." "No," she said. "Eliza, the goats are the dairy," she said. "Selling animals to pay a note is the kind of thing you do when you're winding down, not when you're expanding. It's the wrong direction." "Then what's the right direction?" he said. And there was an edge in his voice that wasn't anger exactly, but was the sound of a man who was tired and worried and needed the person he trusted most to have an answer. She didn't have one yet. She got up and went to the root cellar. She stood in the cellar with a candle and looked at what they had. 26 wheels. The aging structure held another 11. 37 wheels of cheese in various stages, the oldest of them approaching 12 weeks of aging, the newest just pressed this week. She thought about what Martha had said 2 weeks ago, about what they were worth. She thought about the mining camp foreman, Decker, who had asked Rufus to find out who made the cheese. She thought about the freight wagons she'd seen moving through town when the summer was at its worst, the drivers pushing hard to beat the heat, the perishable food going bad before it reached the camps. She thought about what the storm had done to the roads, and then she thought about one specific thing. The road to the valley floor was gone, but the high country track, the rough route that wound up through the boulder fields to the north before cutting east toward the mining settlements, was not a road that flooded. It was higher. It was rougher. It had been impassable in the storm itself, but a storm that put 3 feet of water on the valley floor put a manageable mud on the high country track. The high country track added 4 hours to the trip. But it was there. She came upstairs and said, "I need you to help me load the wagon." Caleb looked up. "Load it with what?" "Cheese," she said. 8 wheels, the best ones. The oldest, the ones closest to ideal aging. "Where are you going?" "The high track," she said. "Around the flooding." He was quiet for a long moment. "That track is rough in good weather, Eliza. After a storm, I know what it is, she said. I've ridden it. On horseback, not with a loaded wagon. Then I'll go light, she said. 6 wheels. I'll pack them carefully. He stood up. I'll go, he said. You need to stay with the herd. If anything happens with the barn roof or the goats get loose, Martha has Thomas, she said. I need you here. She looked at him. I know how to drive a wagon on a rough road, Caleb. I grew up doing it. Not this road. Not this specific road, she agreed, but a road like it. He looked at her for a long time. The particular look he gave her when he was calculating the distance between what he feared and what he believed about her, and trying to decide which one he trusted more. Take the gray horse instead of the bay, he said finally. She's more sure-footed. I know, Eliza said. She was already moving. She left at 7 in the morning with 6 wheels of cheese wrapped in burlap and packed in the wagon bed with straw between them to prevent shifting, a canteen of water, the food left from breakfast, and the money tin with $26 in it, because she wasn't leaving the money in the house while she was gone for any reason, including the illogical one that nothing was going to happen to it. The high country track was exactly as bad as Caleb had feared and slightly better than she'd feared, which was the best possible distribution of the two fears. The gray mare picked her way through the mud with the focused attention of an animal that took her work seriously, and Eliza let her set her own pace and didn't push her and talk to her occasionally, not because she thought the horse was listening, but because the sound of her own voice was useful. She hit the worst section 3 miles in, a long switchback cut through the side of a boulder field where the runoff from the storm had come down the rock face and deposited a significant quantity of mud and small stones across the track in a wide fan. She stopped the mare and got out and looked at it. It was passable. Barely, and not in a way that looked passable at first glance, but she could see the line through it. The place where the surface was worst had a channel running through the center from the runoff, which meant the edges were firmer. She went back to the mare and talked her through it slowly, one measured step at a time, the wagon tilting at an angle that made Eliza's stomach tighten before the right wheels found solid ground again and they came through the other side. She sat on the wagon bench for a moment on the other side of the switchback and let herself feel the shakiness in her hands, and then put it away and kept going. She reached the high junction, the point where the north track connected to the supply road coming down from the mining settlements, at a little past 11. And she found, at the junction, 3 freight wagons. They were stranded. The valley road that connected the supply route to the main settlement was just as badly flooded on the north end as on the south, and the 3 wagons had been sitting at the junction since the previous afternoon, waiting for the water to drop or for someone to figure out an alternative. The drivers were a rough and practical collection of men who had the look of people who had been sleeping in their wagons and were developing opinions about it. Their cargo was visible through the gaps in the wagon covers, crates of goods headed for the mining camps. She could see bread loaves, imperfectly wrapped, already showing the beginning of the gray fuzz that warm, damp air produced on anything made of flour. She could see a side of meat that had the smell she associated with things that were 24 hours from turning. She pulled up alongside the lead wagon. The driver was a heavy-set man in a damp coat who looked at her wagon and then at her with the slightly blank expression of a man who had not expected, at this junction on this morning, to encounter a woman driving alone. "You came from the south?" he said. "High track," she said. "It's passable. Rough, but passable. Your wagons might struggle at the switchback. You'd want to unload some weight before you try it." He looked at her wagon. "What are you hauling?" She climbed down and unwrapped the burlap on the nearest wheel and let him see it. He leaned down from his seat and looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Is that cheese?" "Hard goat cheese," she said. "Aged 8 to 12 weeks. It doesn't need cold storage and it doesn't spoil." He got down from the wagon. He was a man who made decisions with his hands as much as his head. She could see it in the way he moved, the way he reached out and touched the rind of the wheel before he looked at her for permission. She nodded. He pulled out a knife and cut a small piece from the edge. He chewed it. His expression went through several revisions. "Jenkins?" he called out to the driver of the second wagon. "Come here." Jenkins came. He tasted it. He turned around and said something to the third driver. Within 15 minutes, Eliza Marlowe was standing at the junction of 2 mud-soaked tracks in the mountains above Redstone Hollow, conducting the most consequential business transaction of her life so far. with 3 freight drivers who were hungry, stranded, and in possession of perishable goods that were not going to survive another 2 days of waiting. She sold all 6 wheels, not at the regular price, at a price she calculated on the spot, factoring in the scarcity, the circumstances, the condition of their competing food options, and the particular leverage of being the only person at this junction with something that wasn't going to spoil. She did not gouge them. She was not a person who confused advantage with cruelty, but she was fair to herself in a way she would not have been 6 months ago, before she understood what fair to herself actually looked like. She walked away from the junction with hard silver coin in the money tin and the certain knowledge that she had just done something significant, though the full shape of it hadn't revealed itself yet. She was on the road home before she counted it. $41. $41 plus the 26 she'd left with. $67 total. She sat on the wagon bench with the money tin in her lap and the gray mare moving steadily onto the high track in the afternoon light, and felt something she recognized from the very first time she'd tasted the second wheel of cheese, that combination of disbelief and vindication that came when a thing you'd built actually worked the way you'd built it to work. She didn't cry. She had established in her own mind, the day she'd stood in the root cellar with the first good wheel, that she was not a person who cried at success. She was a person who wrote things down and kept moving. She got home at 4 in the afternoon. Caleb was in the yard. He saw the state of her. Road dirty, tired, her coat caked with dried mud up to the elbow from the switchback, and came to the wagon without a word and helped her down. "How bad was the track?" he said. "Manageable," she said. "How'd the roads look to the north?" "Flooded," she said, "but I found the 3 freight wagons from Decker's regular supply line stuck at the high junction." She opened the money tin and showed him. He looked at the money, then at her. "How much?" he said, like he wasn't sure he was reading it right. "Enough," she said. "More than enough." He put his hand over hers on the tin. A brief thing, warm, no other words attached to it. "I need to clean up," she said, "and then I need to go to town tomorrow morning." "For the note," he said. "For the note," she said, "and for something else." She arrived at the Redstone Valley Bank the following morning at 9 o'clock, before most of the business traffic, and she asked to see Director Hale. The clerk who usually made people wait looked at her expression and went directly to the inner office. Hale came out within 2 minutes. She paid the note in full, $30 in coin, on the table 6 weeks before the original due date. She watched Hale mark it satisfied and initial the receipt and hand it across the table. Then she didn't leave. He noticed. "There's something else," he said. "The loan you approved," she said. $150. "Yes." "I want to discuss the use of funds," she said. "I've revised what I need it for, and I want to be transparent with you before I spend anything." He folded his hands on the desk. "All right." She had the new figures with her, more precise than what she'd brought to the first meeting, because she'd had 2 additional months of production data and 3 additional weeks of Rufus's delivery receipts to work from. She put them on his desk, but she didn't need to look at them herself while she talked. She'd been over them enough times that they lived in her head now, the way the seed catalog pages had, the way the pressing schedule had. She told him about winter production, about the silver leaf does and the separate batch she was planning to age through the cold months, about the expanded aging structure and the labor cost and what she expected the 12-week wheels to sell for if the flavor held the way Martha predicted it would. She told him about the 3 freight drivers at the junction and what they'd paid and why they'd paid it, and what that told her about the market she'd been mostly ignoring in favor of the mining camp volume. "There are buyers for something like this who aren't miners," she said. "The hotel in Centerville, the restaurant that opened last spring on the main road, the provisioner who supplies the stage line. These are buyers who pay more for something consistent and good and specifically produced, something with a name attached to it, a mark." She'd brought the M sketch. She put it on the desk. Hale looked at it. "That's not elegant," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's honest. Elegant comes later, if it comes at all." He was quiet for a moment. "You're describing 2 different markets," he said. "Volume buyers, the mining camps, and premium buyers who want something specific. The cheese from the silver leaf does is already different enough to be its own product," she said. "We set it apart. We age it longer. We sell it at a different price to different buyers." She paused. "I don't want to make the decision about how to use the loan without telling you, because you took a risk for us, and that means something to me." Hale looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man adjusting a mental image that had needed adjusting. "The expanded production you're describing," he said. "You'll need additional labor." "I know," she said. "Martha Bell manages the aging and pressing. I'll need 2 more people for the fall and winter. There are families in the valley that need work." "The drought," he said. "The drought," she agreed. "Other operations are failing. There are good workers without income. I'd rather hire from that pool than have them leave the valley." He picked up the M sketch, looked at it, set it down. "Use the loan as you see fit, Mrs. Marlowe," he said. "Within the terms we agreed, that's what I approved it for." He paused. "And get a proper mark made, not this." He pushed the sketch back across the desk. "Something a blacksmith or a woodworker can stamp into a wheel so it's consistent. The mark matters more than you might think." She picked up the sketch. "I know it matters," she said. "Well." The night she got home from the bank, Eliza sat at the kitchen table after Caleb had gone to bed, and Martha had taken Thomas home, and the farm was quiet, and she did something she hadn't done since the first week with the goats. She took out a blank seed catalog page and wrote down not production numbers, not costs, not schedules. She wrote down what had happened, all of it, from the auction forward. The sick goats and the first ruined cheese, and Martha at the broken cart, and Rufus cutting into the first wheel, and Crowder's survey stake, and the storm, and the junction, and the $67 in the tin in Hale's office that morning. She wrote it in the small, tight script she'd always used, the one that fit a lot onto a little space, and she wrote it without any thought about who might read it, because she wasn't writing it for anyone. She was writing it because she had learned, in these months, that the thing you built could disappear from you faster than you expected. If you didn't record it, and she wanted it recorded somewhere outside the unreliable territory of memory. She wrote for a long time. When she finished, the candle was low, and the night outside was fully dark and cold in the way of September nights in the high country. She set down the pencil and read back through what she'd written. It didn't look like much, she thought, a few pages of small handwriting, but it was everything. It was the whole shape of the thing, from 37 sick goats for $2 to $67 in a tin, and a note paid, and a bank loan in her name. She folded the pages carefully and put them in the tin box where she kept important documents, the land deed, the water rights paper, the signed copy of Martha's agreement, and she closed the lid. Outside, the September night was cooling toward frost. On the hillside, 36 goats were in the barn, which Caleb had cleaned and rebedded with fresh straw that afternoon. In the aging structure, 20 wheels sat in the particular darkness that cheese needed to become what it was going to become. Eliza put out the candle. In the morning, there would be the first real frost. In the morning, she would go up the hillside and check on the silver leaf plant stand to see if it had survived the storm and the temperature drop. In the morning, there would be milk to collect and pressing to do and records to update, and a conversation with Martha about the winter batch, and a letter to write to the hotel in Centerville. In the morning, there was more of everything. She sat in the dark kitchen for a moment before she went to bed, not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting in the place she'd built the work from, in the house on the 40 rocky acres that everyone in Redstone Hollow had decided long ago were good for nothing. She had $4 more than she needed. She had 20 wheels aging in the dark. She had a partner and a mark and a route through the high country that she now knew better than anyone else in the valley. And somewhere down the road, in his big house on the fat bottomland, Silas Crowder was sitting with 80 dead cattle and an unfinished stone dairy and a survey stake that had not done what he'd planted it to do. She was not glad about the cattle. She had meant that when she'd said it to Rufus, the animals hadn't done anything wrong. But she allowed herself, in the dark and the quiet, one small specific moment of satisfaction about everything else. Then she went to bed. The first frost came on a Sunday. Eliza was already up when it arrived, which was how she experienced most things that happened before dawn. Not as an event, but as a condition she walked out into. The cold air hitting her face at the barn door, and the hillside above the farm gone silver white in the early gray light. She stood there for a moment and looked at it. The frost covered everything evenly, the rocky slopes and the brush and the deep-rooted plants that had fed the herd all summer, and it made the land look briefly and deceptively, like something soft. She knew better than that by now. She let the goats out after the morning milking and watched them move up the hillside without particular concern about the cold, which confirmed what she'd read in the agricultural pamphlet and what Martha had told her from memory. Goats managed cold better than heat. They were built for difficult terrain and difficult weather. They were built for exactly the kind of land the Marlowe farm sat on. She watched them go and thought, not for the first time, about the particular shape of luck. Not luck the way people use the word when they wanted to dismiss something. Oh, she was lucky. She was in the right place. But luck in the older sense, the sense of a thing that met you halfway. You had to be moving toward it. You had to be looking in the right direction when it appeared. She had been looking. October came in cold and productive. The silver-leaf batch went into aging in the second week, 12 wheels set apart from the regular production on the new cedar shelves in the separate structure Caleb had finished with the loan money. Martha had marked each one with a piece of tied cloth, a different color from the regular wheels, and written the date in the ledger they now kept properly, not on seed catalog pages, in an actual bound ledger that Eliza had bought at the general store and felt a specific quiet satisfaction about every time she opened it. Agnes Pratt had rung her up for the ledger without any of the sighing. The two new workers were a pair of sisters named Dora and Clara Vance, daughters of a cattle family on the South Bottomland whose herd had been decimated by the fever that had taken Crowder's animals. Their father was trying to rebuild, slowly, but there was no income while that happened, and both women were in their 20s and capable and needed the work. Eliza hired them at a fair wage and spent 2 weeks teaching them the pressing and aging process, and discovered in that process that teaching the work forced her to articulate things she'd only understood intuitively, which made her understand them better. "How do you know when the curd is ready to cut?" Dora asked on the third day, leaning over the kettle. "It pulls away clean," Eliza said. "Look, run your finger along the edge here. See how the whey separates cleanly? If it's ragged or milky, it's not ready. What if you're not sure?" "Wait 5 minutes," Eliza said. 5 minutes never ruins a curd that's close. Cutting too early ruins everything." Dora nodded. She was a quick learner, quicker than she seemed to believe about herself, which was a problem Eliza recognized and said nothing about directly, because she'd learned that saying nothing and showing consistently was more effective than any speech about confidence. Thomas, who had turned 8 in October and considered himself a significant veteran of the Marlowe dairy operation, appointed himself Dora and Clara's orientation guide for the parts of the work that happened outside, which mostly involved showing them which goats were which, and explaining their personalities with the seriousness of a small professor. Clara in particular seemed to find this delightful. She had a warm laugh that the yard seemed larger for. Things were working. Eliza could feel it in the way you felt things that were working, not as a triumphant thing, not as relief exactly, but as a steadiness, like ground that had been soft becoming firm under repeated weight. Crowder came on a Tuesday in November. She knew he was there before she saw him because she heard the horse, a distinctive heavy gait she'd learned to recognize over 2 years of occasionally hearing it on the road below the farm, and she came around the corner of the new pressing room and found him at the fence post by the yard. He had dismounted. That was the first thing she noticed. In every encounter she'd had with Silas Crowder, he had conducted himself from horseback or from a position of physical elevation. Standing at her fence post with his hat in his hands, he was just a man. A not tall man in a good coat that had seen a harder season than it was built for. He looked older than he had at the auction. Not dramatically. It was only 4 months. But the summer had done something to him that showed. "Mrs. Marlowe," he said. "Mr. Crowder," she said. She stopped where she was, 15 feet away, and waited. He looked at the pressing room, at the aging structure beyond it, at the hillside where the herd was ranging, smaller dots of movement against the brown and silver of the late autumn brush. "Your operation has grown," he said. "It has," she said. A pause that had weight to it. "I lost 91 head this summer," he said. "Fever. Drought weakened them. The fever finished them." He was not asking for sympathy. His voice didn't have that quality. He was stating a fact the way a man stated a fact he'd made peace with but hadn't forgotten. "My south pasture is recovering. I've restocked some. But the dairy expansion I started in August." He stopped, looked at his hat, looked back at her. "The cheesemakers I hired didn't stay, and I realized once they left that I don't actually know how to do what you do." Eliza said nothing. "I spent a considerable amount of money on a stone building and imported goats and professional labor," he said, "and what I produced was a mediocre product that kept poorly and tasted like nothing in particular." She waited. "I need breeding stock," he said, and I need to understand what you know about the forage." He paused. "I'm asking to buy 3 or 4 of your doughs with the best milk production. And I'm asking," he paused again in the way of a man not accustomed to asking, "whether you'd be willing to explain to my workers how the process actually functions." The yard was quiet. From inside the pressing room, she could hear Dora and Clara working, steady rhythm of it. From the hillside, a faint sound from the herd. Eliza looked at Silas Crowder. She looked at him carefully, the way she looked at things she was trying to assess accurately rather than emotionally. He was not a man who had experienced a change of heart. She didn't believe that and wouldn't have trusted it if she had. He was a man whose circumstances had changed and who was adjusting to those circumstances in the only direction available to him. That was not nothing. Adjusting when you didn't have to was virtue. Adjusting when circumstances required it was just sense. But sense was something she could work with. "I'll sell you 4 doughs," she said. "I'll choose which 4. You don't get to pick." "All right," he said carefully. "The price is fair market for breeding stock of their quality. I'll tell you what that number is, and you'll accept it or you won't." "All right." "As for the knowledge," she stopped. Thought about how to say the next part because it mattered that she said it correctly. "I'll tell you something that your cheesemakers couldn't have told you because they didn't know it and wouldn't have looked for it." He waited. "The reason the cheese from this property tastes the way it does has nothing to do with the goats themselves," she said. "The goats you imported were probably perfectly good animals. The cheesemakers you hired probably knew their trade, but they were working with milk from animals eating purchased feed in a stone building. That's not what makes this work." She looked up at the hillside. "The milk tastes like what they eat. Does that range on the east slope near the silverleaf plants make a different cheese than the does that graze the north brush? The flavor of this land is in every wheel we produce, and you cannot replicate that on your bottomland pasture with hay and grain feed, no matter how good your equipment is." He was quiet. "If you want comparable cheese," she said, "you need the high ground. You need animals that range freely on rough forage. You need to pay attention to which animals eat which plants and what that does to the milk." She paused. "And you need patience. You cannot buy the knowledge that comes from 8 months of watching and failing and trying again." Crowder looked at the hillside for a long moment. "The rocky sections east of my north pasture," he said slowly. "The land I've never grazed because I couldn't run cattle on it." "I've looked at that land from the road," Eliza said. "There's wild mustard on the upper sections, some of the same woody clover we have here." "Useless for cattle," he said. "Not useless for goats," she said. Another silence, a different quality from the ones before it, something working itself out. "You tell me this," he said, "even now, after the water stake and the banknote." She looked at him directly. "I'm not telling you as a favor," she said. "I'm telling you because it's the truth, and the truth is what it is. If you put good animals on that high ground, and you pay attention and you give it time, you might build something worth building. That doesn't hurt me. The valley can have more than one good dairy operation." She paused. "What the valley cannot have, and what I will not tolerate, is another survey stake on my fence line, or another conversation with my bank about notes being called in. If that happens again, we won't be having this kind of conversation." He met her gaze. "It won't happen again," he said. Not warmly, but steadily, the way a man said something he intended to keep. She nodded once. "Come back Thursday," she said. "I'll have the 4 doughs identified and a price ready. Bring someone who can ask questions because I'll only explain the forage once." He put his hat back on. "Thursday," he said. He mounted and rode back down the road. Eliza stood in the yard and watched him go and felt not victory, not satisfaction exactly, something more complicated than either. The feeling of a situation resolving into its actual shape, which was never the shape you imagined when you were in the middle of fighting it. Crowder hadn't been transformed. He hadn't apologized. He'd adjusted and made a practical request, and she'd met it on practical terms. And that was probably the most honest version of how things between people like them actually resolved. She went back into the pressing room. "Who was that?" Dora asked, not looking up from the curd. "Someone who needed some information," Eliza said. Dora nodded and kept working, which was exactly the right response. The county water review came back in the third week of November. The eastern channel boundary, per the county surveyor's formal assessment, fell on the original line established by the land grant, which placed it on the Marlowe side of the fence. Crowder's stake had been removed. The matter was closed. Eliza read the official letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and put it in the tin box with the other documents and went to make the morning milk collection. She did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate about a dispute that should never have been started. What she felt was simpler and more durable than celebration, the particular steadiness of ground that had been contested and was now firm again. Martha was in the pressing room when Eliza came through with the milk. "Water disputes resolved," Eliza said. Martha looked up. "Our way?" "Our way." Martha went back to work. "Good," she said. That was the whole conversation, and it was enough. The Redstone Valley Agricultural Fair happened the first weekend of December, which was an unusual time for a fair, but made sense in a valley where summer had been a season of difficulty and fall had been a season of recovery, and the community had needed something to gather around that wasn't another emergency. Eliza had not planned to enter the cheese competition. The competition had existed for years as a category dominated by the established dairy farms, the soft, fresh cheeses and the butter that the valley's cream-rich cattle operations produced. She had not imagined herself in that category. It was Rufus who suggested it. He'd stopped by in late November with a delivery payment and had stood in the yard afterward for longer than usual, which meant he had something to say that he was working out how to say. "The fair has a hard cheese category this year," he said. "They added it. Decker at the mining camp wrote a letter to the fair committee recommending it. He named the Marlowe Dairy by name in the letter." Eliza looked at him. "He did. Seems some of the camp foremen talked about your cheese at a regional supply meeting and word got back." He paused. "You should enter." "I'm not looking for a ribbon," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "But there are going to be buyers at that fair from Centerville and from the stage line provisioner and from 2 or 3 operations I've been talking to about expanding my routes. These are people who need to see the product and hear the name attached to it in a setting they recognize as legitimate." He held her gaze. "A ribbon helps, but just being there, with the mark on the wheel, in a case at the fair, that helps more." She thought about it for 3 days. Then she told Caleb she was entering. He said, "Which wheel?" "The oldest of the Silverleaf batch," she said. "It's been 12 weeks. Have you tasted it yet?" "No," she said. "I was waiting." They went to the aging structure together that evening, which was something they hadn't done together since the early weeks when Caleb had first helped her build it. He held the lantern while she found the wheel, the one she'd marked with a double-wound cloth, the oldest of the separate batch. She carried it to the pressing room and set it on the work table and cut into it. The inside was denser than the regular wheels, the grain tighter, the color a deeper ivory than cream. The smell was She stood there for a moment, just breathing it, because the smell was something she hadn't anticipated. Something herbal and mineral and complex in a way that made her think of the hillside in summer, of the specific quality of air on the east slope above the boulder field, of a plant with silver leaves and purple flowers that she still didn't have a name for. She cut 2 pieces, gave one to Caleb. He tasted it. His face did the thing it did when something surprised him past his usual careful expressions. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. That's not like anything." "No," she said. "You made that." "We made that," she said. "Martha worked out the aging time. Thomas found the plant stand. Dora and Clara managed the milk separation. You built the structure it aged in." She paused. "We made that." He looked at her. In the lantern light in the pressing room, with the cheese between them on the table, she saw his face do something uncomplicated and real that she recognized from the early days of their marriage, before the hard seasons had layered things over it. "We're going to win that competition," he said. "I don't know about that," she said, honestly. She genuinely didn't. "But we're going to show up." The fair was held on a cold, bright Saturday at the courthouse grounds, the kind of December day that was too cold for comfort and too clear to stay inside. Eliza set up the Marlowe table at 7 in the morning before most of the other exhibitors arrived, and arranged 3 wheels on the cloth. The silver leaf batch at the center, flanked by 2 of the regular production wheels, with the M stamp pressed into each rind. The stamp was new. Caleb had had it made by the blacksmith in October, a proper iron brand on a wooden handle, the M surrounded by the rough hillside outline, clean and readable. It was not elegant. It was honest. Hale had been right that it mattered, and Eliza had been right that honest was enough. People came through the table all morning. Some she knew, some she didn't. She cut samples from the regular wheels and let people taste without commentary, because she'd learned that the cheese said more for itself than anything she could add. She watched faces and paid attention and answered questions when they were asked, and didn't sell in the aggressive way that made people defensive. She saw 2 of the buyers Rufus had mentioned, a heavy-set man from Centerville she recognized by description, and a woman who managed provisioning for a stage line depot 40 miles east. They both tasted. They both stood at the table longer than casual tasters stood. They both asked about volume and regularity and delivery. She gave them both Rufus Kane's name. Martha arrived at mid-morning with Thomas, who had insisted on coming despite a mild cough that Martha had declared was not concerning, and Thomas had declared was barely even there. He stationed himself at the end of the table and watched the cheese with the proprietary attention of someone who had been involved in making it and wanted that acknowledged. A woman stopped at the table with a small girl, maybe 5 years old, and the girl looked at Thomas and then at the cheese and said, "Did you help make this?" "I tracked the goats," Thomas said seriously, "and I found the plant that makes the special one taste different." "What plant?" the girl asked. Thomas considered this. "I don't know what it's called," he admitted, "but it has silver leaves, and Josephine found it first. She's a goat." The girl seemed to find this an entirely satisfactory explanation. Her mother tasted the cheese and asked Eliza for the price per wheel, and Eliza told her, and the woman didn't flinch, which told Eliza that the price was right. The competition judging was in the afternoon. 3 men from the county agricultural committee came through with small knives and notebooks, tasting each entry in the hard cheese category systematically and writing things down without their expressions giving anything away. Eliza watched them from a distance while they worked, not hovering, because hovering suggested anxiety. And she had decided that morning she was not going to perform anxiety today, regardless of what she felt. What she felt was, honestly, something close to calm. Not because she was certain of the outcome. She wasn't certain. She thought the silver leaf wheel was genuinely good, thought it was the best thing she'd made, but there were other entries she hadn't tasted and she didn't know what was in them. She felt calm because she was standing behind a table with the Marlowe mark on 3 wheels of cheese that she had built from nothing, from $2.37 sick animals and a rocky hillside that everyone had dismissed. And the calm was the feeling of a person who had done the actual work and was no longer afraid of being judged by people who hadn't. That was different from confidence, which she'd always thought of as a kind of performance. This was more durable than confidence. It was just the solid fact of the thing she'd made. The judges conferred for 20 minutes. Then the head judge, a gray-haired man with a long face named Aldous Webb, who had been running the fair's agricultural competition for 15 years, walked to the center of the courthouse grounds with a red ribbon and stopped at the Marlowe table. He cut into the silver leaf wheel with his official knife. He tasted it one more time. Then he held up the ribbon and said, "First prize, hard cheese category, Marlowe Dairy, Redstone Hollow." The applause was not thunderous. It was a small fair, but it was real. The specific warm sound of a community acknowledging something it recognized as genuine, and it carried across the courthouse grounds to where Silas Crowder was standing at the edge of the crowd near the fence. Eliza saw him. He met her eyes for a moment, brief and unreadable. Then he looked at the ribbon in the judge's hand and looked away. She did not feel triumphant. She felt, standing there with Webb handing her the ribbon, and Caleb beside her, and Martha and Thomas a few feet away, and the Vance sisters clapping at the end of the table, the specific feeling of a story arriving at a true place, not a perfect place. Nothing was perfect. The road to here had been hard and costly, and there was plenty still uncertain ahead. But a true place, a place that corresponded to what she'd done. Webb leaned toward her and said quietly, "Whatever you're doing with the forage, Mrs. Marlowe, don't change it. There are cheesemakers who have been doing this for 30 years who don't have that flavor." "It's the land," she said. "Most people's land doesn't do that," he said. "Most people's land isn't this land," she said, "and most people don't let the animals teach them what to eat." He looked at her for a moment. Then he moved on to the next award. She drove home in the late afternoon with Caleb and the 3 wheels. One had been awarded the ribbon, but none of them had been sold, because she'd decided before the fair that the first prize wheel was going back to the seller to age another 4 weeks, and then she would cut it and share it with the people who had made it with her. That was not a business decision. It was the other kind. The light was going by the time they reached the Marlowe Road. The hills were dark against the sky, and the first stars were showing above the east ridge, and the farm sat in the fold of the land the way it always had, unchanged from the outside. Everything that had changed was inside it, in the cellar, and the pressing room, and the aging structure and the ledger, in the 4 new does in the barn with the original herd, in the spring pipe from the North Boulder field, in the weekly delivery schedule Rufus kept, and the letters from the Centerville buyer and the stage line woman that were coming, and that Eliza would answer carefully and honestly. In the M on every wheel. Caleb tied the horse and helped her carry the wheels inside, and then stood in the kitchen for a moment with his hat in his hands and said, "You were right about the goats." "You said that already," she said, "months ago." "I know," he said, "but I feel like I should keep saying it until it doesn't feel like I said it late." She looked at him. at the man who had handed her a wagon number at an auction because she'd asked him to, who had built 3 presses and 100 feet of water pipe and an aging structure and had never, in all of it, told her to stop, who had handed her the gray mare's reins and stood in the yard while she drove the high country track alone in the mud after a storm. "You didn't say it late," she said. "You said it exactly when you were sure of it. That's the right time." He thought about that. Then he nodded once and went to see to the horse. She put the red ribbon on the shelf above the kitchen table, next to the M sketch she'd pinned there in September. The sketch had gotten a little soft at the corners from the kitchen steam, but she'd left it up because it was where the mark had started, and she wanted to be able to look at it and remember that the mark had started as a pencil drawing on a piece of paper by a woman who had not yet been sure of anything. That was the part she wanted to remember, not the ribbon, the pencil on the paper. She put a water on for coffee and sat at the table and opened the ledger. There were accounts to update. There were letters to write. There was a conversation she needed to have with Martha in the morning about the second winter batch and whether they had enough of the silverleaf forage identified to sustain it through January. There was a conversation to have with Dora about whether she wanted to take on more responsibility in the pressing room, because Eliza had been watching her for 2 months, and the girl knew more than she'd started with and was ready for more than she was currently being given. There was always more work. That was not a complaint. That was the nature of a thing that was alive and growing. She wrote the date at the top of the ledger page. December. Winter production, first year. She looked up at the M sketch, at the rough hillside and the letter at its center. Somewhere on the hillside in the dark, 36 goats were settled in the barn for the cold night, fed and warm and healthy, and the land outside was covered with frost-stiffened plants that had roots going down 10 feet into the rocky earth, deeper than anything else had reason to go. Plants that had survived every summer the valley had thrown at them. Plants that would survive winter, too, and come back in spring, as they always had. She bent over the ledger. She wrote the first number of the new page, and the Marlowe dairy moved into its second season.